Savior. Written by Sparrow 9642. Chapter 6. An Elite Move. Sunset's eyes slowly peeked open to the sight of the hotel room, the television still on, but in standby mode due to inactivity. However, something else caught Sunset's attention that made her panic. A warmth against her body nude under the sheets. However, upon turning her head and seeing Twilight's head lying across her lower chest, she calmed, recollecting the entirety of the previous night. Strangely, she wasn't sure how to feel about it, but in reality, she had enjoyed every second of it, and even in that moment, she was happy to feel Twilight's warmth around her cold body. She was confused and lost on how she wanted to feel about the whole thing. It was wrong. Vampires and humans should never have done what she had done in the entirety of time and history. It felt like a crime, an offense, a disturbance of nature. But despite it seeming like a problem or crime against nature, she didn't care. She felt normal, happy, and alive. She was thrilled to be in that bed with Twilight and feeling a warmth she had never experienced in her life as a cold and dead being. Guess that lady wasn't crazy after all. She spoke lowly, not wanting to disturb Twilight's slumber. When we go back today, I should apologize. Gently and carefully, Sunset moved out of the sheets. Her motions had caused Twilight to stir, rolling her body to the opposite side of the bed and emanating low moans and breaths. Sunset smiled at Twilight's soft sounds as she worked on getting herself dressed fully, then grabbed the key card to the room. She had started to work towards the door, but stopped upon a sudden thought, turning back to Twilight, snoozing peacefully. While she was hesitant, Sunset just threw her doubts out the window, worked her way back to the bed, and gently pecked Twilight on the side of her head with her cold lips, blushing severely. I'll be back soon. She spoke softly, returning back to the door, opening it, and closing it tight upon entering the one of many corridors of the hotel. With some help from posted directions on the walls and fellow guests of the hotel, Sunset eventually found herself in the lobby where she immediately caught the smell of breakfast. She didn't care for the smell due to her strict diet of blood, but that didn't stop her from approaching the massive display of many breakfast dishes. Waffles, French toast, pancakes, many different cereals, muffins. It was all there, and given Sunset had been watching Twilight for a while, she knew what she had preferred for breakfast. I mean, it's a start, she thought to herself. She approached the breakfast buffet and grabbed a plate, stacking it with 3 pancakes, a couple apples, some syrup packets, and a glass of orange juice. A proper and healthy breakfast for her girlfriend upstairs. Given her abilities as a vampire, she managed to carry the entree back to the room with ease, opening the door and walking into the cool and wide room. She grabbed the provided mini table for the plate balanced in her right palm and gently placed the serving on the flat surface of the mini table. Sunset decided to make it a surprise, wanting to be the best girlfriend she could be. She approached the bed and gently leaned down towards Twilight's open ear. Hey, she whispered gently. Twilight expressed a smile with her eyes still shut, ruffling in the sheets until she was flat on her back. She opened her eyes to Sunset and sleepily replied, Hi. She returned in the same way Sunset had delivered. Sunset held her smile, leaning down and pecking Twilight on the lips, her cold embrace mixing with Twilight's warmth like yin and yang's eternal rhythm. It was a quick embrace, but passionate enough to satisfy both of them as Sunset pulled away. I've got a surprise for you, Sunset teased. Twilight held her smile, uttering a soft and cute, Sunset followed up, grabbing the mini table from the foot of the bed and presenting it to Twilight. Sunset, you didn't have to do that, Twilight commented. Well, too late, sweetheart. Sunset joked, setting the dish down on Twilight's lap. Twilight giggled, looking up at Sunset with a blush and wide smile. This is so sweet. Thank you. Twilight said lowly. It's all out of love. Sunset assured. Plus, I think it's only fair I repay you with something after taking some of your literal life supply. Twilight only continued to smile, to which Sunset returned with a smile of her own, watching as her love eyed the plate. Sunset grew curious. Is something wrong? Sunset questioned. Not at all, Twilight assured. It's just that you chose the perfect combination of things I prefer for breakfast. How did you know? Sunset felt her smile fade. She was afraid of this question. Well, I have a confession to make, Sunset stated, taking a seat on the edge of the bed. Twilight's smile shifted to a grin of curiosity and confusion. All right then, Twilight assured. Letting out a long breath, Sunset started to speak. Before all of this, my mother and I had suspected that the royals of my kind were planning to pull genocide against your kind, an action that we had seen as a crime, and according to our peace treaty with the humans was a crime, one that could lead to a massive war. And we were right. Twilight's face fell to shock as Sunset continued to explain. About 1 week before our first meet at the party, a team my mom had formed in secret had started to notice the disturbance among your kind. Murders and disappearances made to look like human-caused crimes, but those against the royals could read between the lines. Slowly but surely, the royals were sending a message to a secret group that exists among your own people, the Judges of the Bane. A message intending to spark a rise of chaos and literal hell on Earth. My mother and I intended to stop the madness before it began, by taking out those meaning to start it. Our peace with your kind is a very frayed line, but normally if we just stay in line and follow the conditions forged in the treaty that 2 of our greatest vampire lords willingly agreed to, that line will remain uncrossed. The royals clearly don't want peace anymore, so they're trying to force everyone into a battle that the majority can't win. But why? Twilight asked. Why would anyone want chaos intentionally? Because that's what they live for, Sunset confirmed. After my mom was killed, the team she had formed went silent, and it's only a matter of time before all of the killings start again. The only reason they've gone quiet is because of what happened that night when you unintentionally met me. However, before I get to that, back to how I knew your breakfast choice. Part of how this all came to be is the fact that my mom's team members were tasked with watching certain areas. I was one of them, and given my more advanced abilities, I was tasked with watching areas like your school, seeing it is practically a blood buffet. That's how I met you for the first time. Twilight was surprisingly intrigued with Sunset's explanation, but upon the mentioning of Sunset's last comment, her eyes bulged. It wasn't out of interest at first. Voltaire was the one that had taken interest in you, so I had to watch you more than anyone else for your safety. However, while watching you, I grew unexpectedly attracted to you, despite what I am. And that attraction, I suppose, led me to break the rules I was supposed to follow. I saw you leave that night, and while I wasn't even supposed to go anywhere that night, I knew that Voltaire was going to make his move, so I just dropped everything and flew after you. You know the majority of what already happened, except the aftermath. I had intended to only blind him that night, not kill him in any way, but the snob fought me in our flight to the point of where he lost his grip with me, falling to his demise at the force of a raging train. Completely beyond my power to prevent in time, and in the end, nearly cost me my own life. Twilight shivered at the memory of seeing the news the following day after being attacked by Voltaire. A train crash that had been a gory scene of carnage that had occurred the previous night, and while she had an assumption that it had something to do with her encounter with Voltaire, she didn't know it actually was directly linked. She looked at Sunset, noticing her cheery demeanor had died down to something more emotional, and she could see why. It can't be an easy task to eliminate your own kind, despite your thoughts and their intentions. I'm sorry everything came to be like this, Sunset. Twilight sympathized. It sounds like your lifestyle is a very difficult one to live happily. But over the days we've been on this journey together, I've seen you change dramatically. Sunset's gaze met Twilight's instantly upon that comment. You've grown stronger, warmer, and open to the world outside your own. And while humans and vampires will always be natural enemies, it doesn't matter to me. I know you've made me happier than I've been in a long time, and that is a feeling that will never go away. Twilight sat up, placing her right hand on Sunset's cheek, quickly being met with the cold touch of Sunset's own, pressing Twilight's warmth deeper into her icy flesh. A smile slowly started to form as Twilight finished. I'm happy you're here and for all you've done to keep me safe. And please know that I'd never take back any of the moments we've shared in the past days. They were some of the best days of my life, and I only want to make more memories with you. Sunset blushed as mild tears escaped her eyes. You really are something special, Twilight Sparkle. She stated nicely. If only every human could be more like you, then things like this wouldn't even be a problem. It's what I do, Twilight replied jokingly. Sunset giggled at the joking as she got up and turned away from Twilight. Eat up, Sunset commanded nicely. I'm going to run back and get your new and improved wardrobe from Charlotte. After that, we need to get moving. We've stayed here too long, and with Moleskin closing in, it's best we cover a lot of ground before sunset tonight. Okay, but in return, I want you to shower before you go, Twilight proposed. After last night, it's best you get that scent off of you. Otherwise, people are going to... you know. Sunset giggled again. Good point. She agreed. It would be nice not to smell like sweat and a hot mess. Twilight giggled at Sunset's own joking, staring in satisfaction as Sunset stripped herself down to nothing but her bare skin. She licked her lips at the sight. Sunset blushed with a devious smile grazing her lips, blowing Twilight a kiss as a way of teasing her, then turning into the bathroom and shutting the door. Once the sight of Sunset was no longer visible to Twilight's vision, she rolled her eyes with a smile and proceeded to delve into her morning gift from Sunset. A gift she ate as if she were starving, and unintentionally ended up making a mess with the maple syrup, staining her upper chest and the bedsheet, dressing her body mildly. Looks like I'm going to need to shower after all, she confirmed to herself, making her way out of the sheets and towards the bathroom door. The cool air of the room meeting her flesh only heightened her excitement as she entered the steamy room and shut the door behind her, meeting Sunset under the barrage of hot water not long after. Given Twilight's wound from Sunset's fangs was still fresh enough to act like a beacon for their enemies, Sunset had taken the task of driving back to Ashley's to retrieve her unpaid-for wardrobe. She had made sure to check she had her wallet with her twice before leaving Twilight, feeling its presence against her ass as she pulled up to the front of the store. The open neon sign in the main front window was enough of an assurance that she wasn't too early or wasting energy on walking up to a closed store, so she got out of the vehicle, leaving it running. This trip wouldn't take her very long, and she needed to stop for gas anyways before she and Twilight moved on to their next unknown destination. The familiar bell chime rang upon opening the door, and Charlotte's attention spiked at the recognition of Sunset, expressing a smile that beamed from ear to ear. "So glad to see you're okay, dearie," she greeted with sincerity. "You gave your friend and I quite the scare." Sunset sighed and did her best to smile. "Yeah, I'm sorry about that. As much as the way I acted prior." Sunset kindly gestured. Charlotte continued to hold her smile. "No need to apologize. I shouldn't have been so nosy about something so personal. If anyone needs to apologize, it's me." Sunset waved her hand in a way of dismissal, finally managing to express a true smile. Charlotte's smile changed to a grin of confusion upon the gesture, but Sunset eased her confusion with her next set of words. "You opened my eyes. There's no apology necessary for that. Besides, you were right. Only on my hospital bed last night, not knowing if I was going to live or die from whatever rotten food I ate prior to coming here, did I realize just how deeply I cared for Twilight. If it weren't for her actions, I'd probably be dead right now. The fact that she was there by my side, up to the point when the doctors managed to flush out whatever caused my fall, made me realize that she loved me. And despite my dumbfound blindness, I loved her as well." Charlotte paused, but eventually a smile creeped onto her face. She simply nodded at the words stated by Sunset and patted her on the shoulder. "I'm glad I could help you find the happiness you were blind to, and I really do hope you two end up a happy couple in the future. Just take time to smell the roses every now and then," Charlotte advised. Sunset caught the message clearly and just nodded in agreement. "Now, let's get your love's new and improved wardrobe all paid for and loaded up." "Right," Sunset agreed, following Charlotte towards the back of the store where a giant stack of many different types of clothes were in wait for purchase. The total added up to $452.18, to which Sunset answered with a nice handful of 5 Benjamins. Given how naturally curious Charlotte was, Sunset was surprised that she didn't question her on where and how she got this amount of money from. It relieved her, seeing the hospital story was hard enough to come up with on the spot. The less she had to explain, the better. It took a few trips, but eventually the car was loaded up with Twilight's new clothes, and to that, Sunset sighed in relief, closing the trunk. Charlotte greeted her one last time, and to Sunset's surprise, it had been nothing close to a goodbye. "I almost forgot. Not long after you and your girlfriend left, someone came by asking for you," Charlotte informed. Sunset felt her skin shiver at the comment, knowing that it wasn't good news. She knew it also implied that Moleskin was closer to them than she would have liked, and that meant that getting out of town wasn't going to be easy. "Did you tell them anything?" Sunset trembled. "Seeing I had no idea who they were or their implications, I just told them that I hadn't seen you or the other girl," Charlotte answered. "Why? Is someone looking for you?" "I suppose you could say that, but maybe I'm not the specific Sunset they're looking for. However, just for better clarification, what did they look like?" Sunset asked, turning to face Charlotte. Charlotte assembled a posture that reflected heavy thought, taking a moment to reflect on last night's customers. "I can't remember very clearly, but they should be visible on the surveillance cameras," she clarified. "Mind if I take a look?" Sunset asked. "I fear it's my ex-boyfriend who's out to kill my girlfriend. He's one nasty case of jealousy, and I'd prefer he doesn't even know where I am. Oh my, Charlotte said, putting her hands over her mouth. Be my guest. Just give me a moment to get the footage backed up to the proper time last night. Thank you. Sunset finished, waiting for Charlotte to make her way back into the store. Once she was out of sight, Sunset broke. Shit! She cussed under her breath. Moleskine is even closer than I thought, meaning that likely he has eyes on me right now. She took a moment to focus her senses on the surrounding area, eyeing every rooftop, person, and examining every sound from beyond a human's natural ability. She heard birds, wind, and even caught the sound of chatter in an airplane flying high across the sky. Nothing close to a vampire. He's brought out the elites of his roster. She clarified to herself. We won't get out of town without being swarmed and attacked. That's a death wish if we even try. So we need to somehow find a way out undetected. She took a moment to think, rationalizing the best way to go about somehow getting out of this mess. If I know Moleskine well, his intent is not to kill us, only to use others to hunt us down and bring us back to him. He's not a pounce and attack kind of hunter. He's patient and clever, and only when he gets what he wants will he even try killing his prey, personal or not. Her thoughts were interrupted by Charlotte, the bell chime of the door breaking her focus. I've got the footage, she clarified simply. Sunset nodded, making her way back into the building and following Charlotte to the farthest room in the back of the store. A single monitor was on, depicting a shot of a tall figure at the front desk of the store at about 11:45 p.m. the night prior. Sunset instantly recognized the tall figure, knowing her assumptions were now true. Is that him? Charlotte asked with worry in her voice. Yep, that's my ex. She lied, dreading the miraculous escape she was going to have to pull in order to keep Twilight and herself out of Moleskine's clutches. The drive back to the hotel had been a stressful task, Sunset having to multitask on listening for any approaching enemies while keeping her eyes on the road. She had one advantage against Moleskine's spies, sticking to crowded highways to avoid any surprise attacks, knowing these elites wouldn't dare give themselves up to mortals. She still hadn't taken any chances, parking the vehicle in an area where it was hidden well and taking a heavily obscure route back to the hotel's back entrance. In the end, she had probably walked a good mile or so from the car's parked area, but in doing so, had avoided any encounters. She took the elevator back to the room and quickly made haste through the empty halls, opening the door and shutting it quickly. The action had startled Twilight, sitting on the end of the bed closest to the door with a look of worry on her face. What's going on? Twilight asked with worry. Did something happen? I'm afraid so, Twilight. Sunset replied, worry staining her own tone. We're in danger, and getting out of town just got nearly impossible. Twilight gulped. What do you mean? Did you run into them? Twilight asked. Sunset immediately grew confused, not expecting that answer from Twilight. Who was she referring to? Run into who? Sunset questioned, scratching her head. The police, Twilight answered. Sunset grew more confused, to which Twilight caught onto. You don't know, do you? Twilight questioned. Know what? Sunset replied. Twilight didn't answer, only pointed to the muted and paused flat-screen TV. It was tuned to the morning news, and upon seeing the picture of Twilight in the left corner of the screen, Sunset felt her skin shiver. Twilight picked up the remote, unmuted the TV, and resumed the program. In today's news, we have a report of a missing girl who is a suspect of the attempted murder of Bella Thompson. The report was filed yesterday after the girl had been missing for 3 days as of today. Her name is Twilight Sparkle. She's 17 years old, stands around 5 foot 8 inches tall, and has long violet hair with 2 small streaks of pink and a lighter purple in it. She is most likely traveling in her regular vehicle with the license plate as displayed on the screen. If you have seen this vehicle, please inform the police immediately. She's not considered armed and dangerous, but Canterlot City Police are advising to use caution upon approach. If you have seen her, you are advised to call the police immediately so that proper actions may be taken. Rosa Parks, Live 18 News. You've got to be kidding me! Sunset huffed, holding her hands on her head. Just when I thought our situation couldn't get any worse. Why? What's going on aside from this? Twilight asked. Sunset turned to meet Twilight's gaze, still holding her head with her cold hands. Moleskine has taken the initiative to send his top elites to collect us, and they're already on our trail. Sunset informed. One came looking for me at Ashley's last night. Can't we just outrun them? Twilight questioned. We've managed to do so already, so what makes them any different from the others? We had the advantage by distance, but now that they're here, that advantage is out the window. Plus, these are ruthless hunters that are excellent at tracking and succeeding. They can track anything from just a speck of blood or even a single footprint. My injury was intended to buy time for his ace hunters to catch up. Clever bastard. Twilight didn't argue. She knew Sunset was dead serious, so she just tried assisting and finding some way to outwit these aces in the field of tracking. So, what do we do? Twilight asked. I don't know. Sunset replied in defeat. Moleskine has played his cards well here. He's essentially made it to where we can't leave, considering the road out of town is not a crowded one. Otherwise, this would be simple to counter. Now it's a matter of either acting or waiting for Moleskine to come and take us away. That's the way Moleskine has always liked to hunt. Twilight could see that Sunset was down for the count, so she took the initiative to come up with something. Everything had a weakness, so all she had to do was find it and use it to her advantage. Then there was the issue with police, which made things harder but not impossible. The police were only looking for her, not Sunset, so all she had to do was fool the police and the elites enough to get out of range of things like cameras and civilization. Her brain spiked upon devising a plan that just might solve the problem. I got it! Twilight said confidently, catching Sunset's attention. You said that these elites wouldn't attack crowded places, right? Right. Sunset clarified in confusion. Well, then all we need to do is fool them with a diversion. One that would cause them to lose our trail. Specifically me. Sunset raised an eyebrow. Where are you going with this? Sunset questioned. It's simple. The police are looking for my car, so if you took my car and traveled the highway routes, these elites would have no choice but to follow my car. That would buy me time to get to a town nearby, while you take care of the elites. Twilight, elites are of a different caliber of my combat skills. I couldn't handle all of them on my own. Twilight only nodded. I know, and that's why I'm going to need to know what weakens vampires, because we're going shopping for 2 things: ingredients for a vampire repellent and hair dye. Chapter 7. Escape. The trip had been short, the only product spot being enough garlic to feed an army of hungry soldiers that had a strange addiction to said product, 2 spray bottles, black hair dye, and 2 plain gray hoodies. Sunset had provided Twilight with the information and funds while she made the trip. Sunset surveying from above to be sure of Twilight's safety. Twilight applied the hair dye first, jumping at the sight when she saw her reflection in the mirror. This was the first time in her life she had ever dyed her hair, so to see it outside its natural color was definitely a shocking sight. Sunset had found it cute, but Twilight was already making a countdown for when her natural color would come back, thankful that it was only a temporary addition to her appearance. Aside from that, nothing had happened the entire trip, and currently only the putrid, lingering scent of garlic chives being cut up and ringed into a liquid concoction filled Sunset's senses like a non-existent enemy. In all honesty, the scent attacking her was an enemy, garlic being one of a vampire's greatest weaknesses. She hissed at the essence like a displeased cat being disturbed from its peace, praying for Twilight to finish up whatever god-forsaken potion birthed from a witch's brew she'd created in the small room. Her fangs glistened as Twilight continued to mince the putrid vegetable, liquid seeping from its many pores into the spray bottles that Twilight had bought along with the many chives, dye, and hoodies. The process had been occurring for a good hour, and with the satisfying sound of Twilight tightening the spray nozzles, Sunset sighed in relief. Thank the Lord above. Sunset celebrated, her nose still plugged. Twilight rolled her eyes. You know you didn't have to stay in the room, right? Twilight questioned annoyingly. You could have left at any time. Sunset grunted. With the elites within our perimeter, I wasn't going to take chances of ending up in a fight where I couldn't win, even if it's unlikely that they'd attack first. Understandable. Twilight agreed. Now, you said that garlic is incapable of killing vampires, correct? Sunset nodded. Garlic only temporarily stuns my kind. The scent attacks our senses with an effect similar to shock for your kind. Like how you'd react after being shot by a gun. It only results in a temporary stun that, for lower-rank vampires, remains in effect for 5 minutes. However, for higher-rank vampires like the elites, who are trained to counter the effects of garlic, the stun will only last about 30 seconds. So if you manage to stun one, act fast. You may not get a second try. Their stun will also be different from a lower rank. They will still be mobile, but their sight and focus will be inaccurate. You'll have a good chance to get out of their sight if you get out of sight within 10 seconds. Remember, you only need to spray within their vicinity, similar to aiming with a shotgun. Our sense is much more powerful than yours, and it only takes the slightest contact to trigger a stun. Twilight nodded in understanding. May I ask what exactly your plan is again? You weren't too specific about it. Sunset requested. Twilight smiled and nodded, playfully rolling her eyes. You're going to take my car as a diversion to fool these elites, while I take a bus or taxi to a place where we can meet after you take care of the elites. We'll use the hoods of our hoodies to hide our identities, so our enemy won't be able to tell us apart. They'll assume me to take my car, which is why you'll be taking it, and once they pounce, you use the garlic to stun and take them out. Once the dust settles, we meet up where the bus will drop me off, which is the gas station closest to the exit of town. We'll each take a bottle for defense, and if all goes well, we can move to wherever you plan to go next. If we fail, well, we can say we gave it a damn good try. Sunset smiled, meeting Twilight's gaze with her sapphire blue irises. Her hand met Twilight's own, tightening into an embrace of care and agreement. While Sunset wasn't in complete agreement with the plan, she knew it was probably the best idea in this situation. The embrace lasted for a good minute, up until they finally released the grip and proceeded to slip on their new plain hoodies, grab the vampire repellent, and spraying the room down with a massive amount of perfume to somewhat cloak the sickening essence of garlic. Before going their separate ways, they shared a short, potentially final kiss, and after pulling away, took off to separate exits of the building. Twilight took the front entrance, pulling her hood over her head and tightening it before stepping out into the open lobby. She got lucky yet again, nobody suspecting her shady appearance, and exiting out into the open world once again. The many sounds of traffic and some nearby radio station playing some upbeat tune met her concealed eardrums as she eyed the bus stop across the street. Luck shone on her yet again, finding 0 people occupying the area, and to that she smiled and breathed a long sigh of relief. Using the crosswalk, she found her way over to the bus stop and kept her head low as she waited for the city bus to arrive within the next 5 minutes. Sunset used her vampire speed to make the trek back to Twilight's car as soon as she exited the side door of the building. She'd made sure to tuck away every strand of her fiery locks before exiting, pulling her hood tight over her head and tying the strings into a tight double knot. With her identity concealed behind the darkness of the hood, she blazed her way to where she had parked Twilight's car, getting in fast and kick-starting its ancient metal heart to life. Guiding the metal trap out into the open, Sunset found her way onto the open road, her nerves shaking and non-existent heart racing in anxiety. She took a deep breath in and held it for a few seconds, releasing it slowly and feeling her body calm a little as she continued to drive the legal speed limit. She wasn't so much anxious over fighting the elites, but more over Twilight's safety. There was a heavy chance that this plan wouldn't work, seeing they were dealing with well-trained vampires. Would they really assume Twilight to take the car? Would the garlic be enough to give Sunset an advantage over the elites? Was Twilight setting herself up for a trap? She could feel her nerves starting to act up again, so she quickly repeated the same tactic as before, quickly reassuring herself. You can't protect her forever, Sunset. Eventually she's going to have to defend herself, and that time is now. So it's best to just focus on what I need to do and trust that Twilight can take care of herself. Until we meet back up at the gas station. A smile met her face, and she felt all of her anxiety falter as she continued to drive, moving onto the highway that led to the exit of the town. The highway was crowded with plenty of cars to avoid interaction with the elites, but she still had to worry about highway patrol officers due to the fact that police were looking for Twilight's car. She hoped that nobody would recognize the car and just did her best to follow the rules of the road, driving carefully and cautiously up until she came to the main exit and the number of cars slowly began to dwindle to nothing, to which Sunset responded by preparing herself for impact. Here we go. The bus arrived as scheduled, and using the money Sunset had lended Twilight, she stepped into the rectangular vehicle with wheels and paid the driver the amount needed to travel to her destination. The driver eyed her oddly, given her appearance of wearing a hood in the middle of summer, but seeing he had no say in the matter, he just let her pass and take her seat. Twilight sighed heavily, taking a seat near the back of the bus and just keeping her head low. It felt like forever before the bus started to move to its next destination, Twilight growing more and more anxious in her seat. Even as the bus started to move, Twilight's nerves continued to dance wildly. It was the first time in 3 days that Sunset wasn't by her side, and despite living on her own constantly before all of this, she felt lost and scared. The fear was due to the situation at hand, but the lost feeling was due to something she couldn't explain. It was odd and overbearing, and as she continued to sit, she suddenly had the urge to cry. She shook her head in an attempt to shake off the urge, but it only made it worse, escalating into something similar to nausea. Come on, Twilight! Pull yourself together! She chastised to herself. The urges only got worse and worse, but she fought it as hard as she could, somehow managing to keep her tears back and stomach contents at bay, up until something broke all of her focus entirely and washed away all of the urges. Odd time of year to be wearing a hoodie, isn't it? Spoke a voice across from her. She didn't look, but she knew she had to answer, Otherwise, she'd look even more suspicious than she already was. Twilight cussed heavily in her mind, and out of desperation, gave the best lie she could. It's a medical disorder I have. My skin reacts badly to the sun, so I have to keep my skin clothed. She lied. Oh dear, what an unfortunate fate. The same mid-range male voice spoke. However, what I find strange about that is that for someone who resents the sun so much, you tend to spend a miraculous amount of time with one whose name resembles the sun. A sunset, actually. Twilight's heart plummeted like a stone. The plan had failed, and the worst possible scenario that could have happened in the entire situation was happening. Even if she stunned him, there was nowhere she could run to. She was literally trapped in a hunk of metal that she couldn't exit at her own will. She was doomed. Shit! I'll give you credit, human. Your plan was quite clever, but we elites are trained for such schemes, so it was easy to just split up and follow both of you. There's more power in numbers, and 2 against 2 is enough to outwit a vampire and human to us elites. Twilight cussed in her mind again, realizing she had missed one detail. Of course they would split up and follow both. It's one of the oldest strategies in tracking someone. She wanted to faceplant herself so hard, but she didn't. She needed to figure out how the hell she was going to get out of this, and so far, she wasn't seeing any way out. Her only saving grace was the fact that the bus was full of passengers, so she had a while to think of some way out of this. Now, I am a vampire of mercy, and I'm willing to offer you a chance to just surrender. The elite proposed. If you do, no harm will come to you or your companion. However, if you refuse, you will be submitted by a very painful tactic. You and I know very well you cannot fight a being of mass strength and abilities beyond your kind, so you'd have no chance to even defend yourself against me. This is my only offer, human. So, will you take it, or refuse like a fool? The road had become practically deserted by the time Sunset had reached the gas station. It had clearly been deserted for a good 5 years or so just by the condition of the outside of the building. Worn paint starting to chip from the surface, windows covered by streaks of dirt and dust from rain and heavy winds, and the gas pumps looking as if they'd been beaten to death by a bat. She pulled the vehicle up to the pumps closest to the entrance and got out of the vehicle to listen for any sign of the foe in pursuit. She focused on the area around her. She heard nothing except the wind and the rustling of loose paneling hanging from the building's sides flopping in the mild breeze. No wings or evident presence of the elites within her vicinity. Her dead heart sank almost immediately, knowing the elites had caught on and Twilight was in danger. She rushed back to the car, shifted into drive, and revved the vehicle out of the gas station's lot like a mad woman. However, just as she made it to the road, something seized the vehicle in its tracks. A figure standing on the hood of the car with a bang, and smashing the windshield to nothing but shards. The impact stunned Sunset, lifting her from the seat and crashing back down with a thud, her head bouncing off of the headrest of the seat. Regaining her focus, she realized that she had been outsmarted, and was going to have to fight her way out of this. She clicked off her seatbelt, opened the door, and looked out to the road. Standing before her was a casually dressed male. He was tall, mildly muscular, and his skin was pale as the moon's glow. His hair was spiky and black as night, and as he stared at her with his crimson eyes, Sunset realized quickly that she was in for the most challenging fight of her life. She couldn't make even a single mistake. Well, if it isn't Vladimir's own flesh and blood. The vampire spoke, his voice rich and ancient, I won't lie. I never expected you to betray us over a casual human, but I guess I was mistaken. Sunset just held her gaze with his, eyeing him with anger. And what do you even know about me? Sunset countered. I'm at least dignified enough to not have to rely on the royals for everything I need, like you. I lead my own life outside of the bullshit laws that our race is forced to follow. I'm not just another sheep to the shepherd. I don't need to know much to know exactly what you are, peasant. He insulted. You were born a stubborn brat, and once your mother's head was put on the cutting board over your actions, you went rogue, thinking us the enemy when it was your fault all along. Sunset felt a tinge of guilt strike her cold heart, knowing what he was saying was true and that it was her fault her mother had ended up dead in the first place. However, she shrugged the guilt away with a single tear and struck back at the elite with an even stronger truth. You're right. My mom is dead because of me. But I've accepted that fact and have redeemed it by doing what's right. My mom always hated you pompous freaks, and I know she'd be proud of me for what I'm doing. Betraying your own kind? Now I see where that Spitfire attitude of yours comes from. He taunted with a chuckle. No, not betrayal. Proving that our order is all a lie and was created only as a way of controlling us to do what they want. That's the only reason why the royals eliminate rebels like me, because they know we can make a difference and turn the entirety of the vampire race against them. They silence us to prevent the real truth from being heard. A sudden realization hit Sunset like a ton of bricks. She felt tears build up in her eyes like a breaking dam, knowing she'd just solved the real reason why the night of her conviction, Raz had enticed her mother into sacrificing herself for her. She clenched her fists so tight that her fingernails had punctured her cold skin, and her anger grew with each second. You bastards! That's why she's dead! She raged. What in the world are you even talking about? The elite questioned. The royals knew of my mom's plan to stop the war they were trying to start, as much as the rebellion she was building to take them down. And as a way to stop her, they forced her into a position where she had no choice but to spare my life for hers. Anger, rage, sadness. It all overwhelmed her in an unfathomable phenomenon all at once. Her head down and tears falling like raindrops. You monsters! You're sick, twisted, and need to be shown no mercy, just as you did her. Her emotions grew higher and higher, more intense with each passing second, resulting in the elite taking a few steps backward. He couldn't explain why, but he was afraid. Afraid of Sunset in her current state, and upon Sunset's next action, he had every right to be shaking in his boots. You're going to pay! Sunset raged, raising her head to where her face was visible, and upon the sight, the elite was thrown into absolute fear and shock. Sunset's eyes were no longer the cool aqua color they usually were. They instead showed a raging gold that blazed like an untamed bonfire. Her hair seemed to share the same fiery blaze, her fangs glistening in the display of unadulterated anger. A display that had never occurred before in Sunset's entire existence as a vampire. This was something different. She lunged at an immeasurable speed, beating contact with her foe under less than even a second. The elite had no chance to react, Sunset collapsing into his chest and immediately following with the sound of breaking bones. It wasn't just a few bones. It was the entire capacity of his chest cavity. Sunset had struck with an immense amount of force. A force that had made all of the experience, training, and reputation of the elite completely obsolete. He was destroyed within seconds. Sunset continued to strike non-stop, the hits dismembering all of his limbs and shredding his body to nothing but a gory and scattered massacre. The elite hadn't even had the chance to scream in pain during the entire onslaught. It had started and ended so quickly that no mortal could see it if they had blinked. No mercy, no remorse. Sunset was done playing merciful. The royals had pushed her past her ability to control her emotions. The scattered remains of the elite lay on the ground as the dust settled, and all Sunset reflected in the daylight was absolute rage. She didn't care anymore. The elite only muttered and grunted in defeat, too mutilated to repair themselves. Sunset stood above them high and mighty, and with one stomp to their head, the elite was no more, and Sunset was victorious. The essence of absolute rage didn't dissipate, though, as Sunset took to the sky with her wings extended wide and free. The car was pointless right now, and her beloved was in danger. She'd make them pay for everything. The stops passed along with time for Twilight to escape from her current assailant, and with each stop, her nerves shook more and more severely. She had just remained silent in her seat the entire ride, devoid of any plan to escape her situation, and the elite's presence growing more and more unsettling. The bus had made it to the outside of the city, and was currently making a stop at a gas station in some small town that you could enter by taking one of the first exits off the highway. Something Twilight didn't want. Seeing the less people on the bus, the less chance she had at coming up with some miraculous plan. More stops came, up until only a few remained, and the elite spoke up once again.
Time is almost up, human. Will you or will you not take my offer of mercy?
I don't need an empty bus to knock you out cold, so I suggest you answer me before the next stop. Otherwise, I won't hesitate to do so against your will. His tone was serious, and Twilight couldn't help but pray. She prayed for Sunset to somehow know she was in danger and show up to save her yet again. But deep down, even she knew Sunset wasn't capable of hearing her pleas from miles away. She had to either fight or surrender. I'd never surrender to a monster like you, she answered under her breath.
Then pain is what you shall receive, mortal.
The elite answered, following with the sound of the bus coming to a stop.
Perfect timing.
He added,
Don't worry. The next time you awake, you'll be one step closer to death at the hands of Lord Moleskin. Farewell, mortal.
Twilight turned to see him as she gripped the garlic spray in her long hoodie pocket. He was a tall, pale-skinned man dressed in a black coat and blue jeans. His eyes disguised by sunglasses and hair being long and bleach blonde in color. He fit the description of a vampire lord very well. All he needed was black robes and a cane with some fancy emblem as a grip, and he would have fit it perfectly.
Time to go to sleep, dear,
he stated, lifting his right arm to strike. Then he stopped instantly, and until Twilight looked toward the center column of the bus did she realize why. Standing in the center of the bus was a hooded Sunset Shimmer, her face barely visible in the light of the bus. Twilight was instantly surprised and relieved at the sight of her beloved, but then another thing caught her attention: the smell of garlic. Sunset had stunned the elite, and what followed next made Twilight realize just how lethal Sunset really was. Sunset threw a punch that struck the side of the elite's face, throwing him toward the back of the bus and breaking the hinges off the emergency exit door. Twilight was stunned at the sight, up until she remembered what she did to the bear, kicking it through the bodies of healthy and thick trees. Sunset acted in quick succession, grabbing Twilight's hand and blazing down the aisle of the bus into the open world once again. None of the occupants of the bus had even seen the emergency exit being destroyed, because the impact and escape from the bus had happened in less than a second. They'd escaped unseen and without suspicion. Sunset carried Twilight over her shoulder as she ran undetected for miles. She knew the elite wasn't dead, but that wasn't what she was aiming for. All she wanted was Twilight by her side once again. She ran until she knew she couldn't be tracked by the elite, stopping in an alleyway and letting Twilight back onto her feet. Twilight was a little disoriented from the speedy escape, but her happiness overshadowed it, happy to be with Sunset once again. However, once she saw Sunset more clearly, a small tinge of fear and confusion made her hesitate in embracing her. She saw that Sunset's eyes were now golden, and her usual calm demeanor was absent. It frightened Twilight, feeling like Sunset was eyeing her as a meal rather than as a lover reunited with her beloved.
Sunset? Why are your eyes golden? And why do you seem so predatory towards me?
She spoke in fear. Huh? Sunset finally spoke. At the sight of seeing Twilight cowering in fear of her, Sunset felt tears build up, snapping back to reality.
Oh my god. I'm so sorry, Twilight.
She quickly stated. Twilight engulfed her in a hug off those words, knowing Sunset was truly sorry. She wanted to cry at their reunion, but she held them back, knowing they weren't necessarily safe from harm and they had to remain cautious.
I'm sorry for leaving you,
Twilight stated. Tears escaped Sunset's eyes as she pulled Twilight closer, reassuring Twilight in her current state. Don't be, Sunset assured. You did all you could for both of us. There's no shame in that.
I know, but I missed you so much,
Twilight stammered. Sunset felt a ping in her chest, knowing Twilight wasn't joking around. She still found it hard to believe that a human would have ever cared for her as much as Twilight did. Pulling away from Twilight, she pecked her beloved on her warm and soft lips, her cold touch jolting Twilight's nerves. Twilight returned the subtle display of affection, feeling her sadness and guilt drift away in Sunset's presence. They pulled away and smiled at one another, up until Sunset broke the silence, knowing caution was still needed.
Now what do we do, Sunset?
Twilight questioned. We fly. She answered simply. I know a place we can go that the elite or Moleskin won't even think about, and I think they can also help us. It's not far from here. Having no better options and full trust in Sunset, Twilight agreed and took Sunset's hand.
I trust you, Sunset. Whatever you have in mind, I'll follow it.
Ripping through the cloth of the hoodie and extending her long and ragged wings, Sunset tightened her grip with Twilight's hand and pulled her closer to her chest. Then hang on and don't let go of me. I have to fly fast to avoid being noticed by that elite. Twilight nodded as assurance. Then in a sudden flash of speed and gust of wind, Twilight found herself held in Sunset's chest above the clouds. For once, she was thankful she didn't have a fear of heights, knowing she was easily over 1,000 feet high in Sunset's embrace. She just held on and didn't let go up until they descended from the sky, down into a heavily wooded environment. The landing felt like a rush, and as much as the view and feel of the flight was incredible, she was happy to be back on the ground safely. Sunset released her beloved, then folded her wings back into the safety of the hoodie, quickly eyeing the area and surveying the entirety of the wood with her enhanced senses. She was relieved to know that the other occupants were either indoors or out hunting. Twilight, I need you to stay here while I make our newest acquaintance aware of our presence," Sunset ordered with a serious tone. Twilight didn't argue. "Okay," she agreed simply. Sunset nodded. "Shouldn't be more than a minute or two." With that, Sunset disappeared into the thickets, up until she came to an ancient tree just beyond Twilight's vision. She approached the healthy trunk of the mass and knocked in a certain pattern that was specifically assigned as a safety mechanism for Sunset's family. Silence followed the knocks, aside from the chitter-chatter of the woodland creatures speaking to one another amongst the foliage. Eventually, a light pitter-patter of footsteps became audible from beyond the hollow door of the ancient mass. Sunset knew those steps well, and as they got closer, Sunset heard a familiar tune being hummed. One her mother once sang to her as a child. The door began to creak open, revealing in the doorway an average-height woman with fiery red hair and glasses adorning her eyes. She was just as Sunset remembered her, from her hair that radiated in the sunlight to her outdated attire dressed with a very strong perfume. "Sunset?" The woman squeaked excitedly. What are you doing here, sweetie?" Sunset giggled. "It's good to see you too, Grandma," she greeted sweetly. Chapter 8. Truths Untold and Horrors Unseen. The greeting between Twilight and Sunset's grandmother had gone surprisingly calm, not being intimidated or even threatened by a human's presence in their midst. It had shocked both Sunset and Twilight, expecting resilience rather than the elderly vampire greeting and welcoming Twilight into her humble abode like she would any other vampiric guest. Despite the shock, Twilight and Sunset took the greeting without question, deciding it best to just go with the flow. Sunset knew she had nothing to worry about, but she couldn't help but keep her guard up as she entered and took a seat on her grandmother's couch. With all that had happened as of late, she wasn't sure who she could trust of her own kind, even if it was someone of her own blood. They were served tea, to which Sunset warned Twilight to resist drinking, up until she had tasted it herself. While her grandmother had taken leave from the living room, she had secretly swapped her cup with Twilight's to test, and luckily there was no poison or vampiric-based concoctions within the liquid's consistency. To that, Sunset could finally assure her grandmother wasn't an enemy to her or her beloved, so she calmed down and posed her body into a comforting demeanor as if she were resting at home. Twilight merely rolled her eyes with a smile, having felt there was no ill will towards her from the sweet and elderly lady. Nonetheless, she understood why Sunset had acted so paranoid, and to that, she just took a sip of her tea. It was a tea unlike anything she'd ever tasted before, having a bitter yet pungent sweetness that caused her to react in absolute surprise. Sunset snickered at the reaction. "What? Can't handle vampire signature tea, mortal?" she joked. "Oh, shut up!" Twilight retorted in annoyance. Sunset chuckled again. "It's okay. I reacted the same way my first try too." She confessed. "My grandma prefers a strong brew." "Indeed I do." An elderly voice broke the conversation, Sunset's grandmother having returned from the living room with her own cup of the spicy brew. "It's the only way you can be prepared for anything nowadays. One sip and you're awake for the entire day." She took a seat in her rocking chair across from Twilight and Sunset, taking a sip of her jolty tea and having zero reaction to it. "So, what brings you kiddies to my home? Let alone, how did my granddaughter end up with a human of all things?" Sunset took a sip of her own, letting out a long breath before speaking. "To put it straight, I'm on the run from Moleskin, seeing he's out for Twilight's blood." She started, I don't know why, Grandma, but something told me to save Twilight from that freak. And now, I'm having to risk my life to fend off Moleskin's forces and to keep her safe. To be completely honest, I don't know why I'm doing this, but I feel I'm doing the right thing. Especially after what they did to Mom. A tear had escaped Sunset's eye, to which Twilight responded by hugging her beloved tightly in her arms. Sunset's grandmother changed her demeanor entirely from jovial to serious, eyeing her reflection in her tea with sorrow. I see. She started simply. It was wrong what they did to your mother and my daughter. But what you're doing is reckless, my dear. By doing this, you're not only putting yourself in danger, but your entire race and family as well. By putting yourself out in public, you risk exposing yourself as what you truly are, and while you may or may not be doing the right thing, you must accept that there are certain things that are beyond our control. And if we attempt to break that control, we or someone close to us ends up paying the price for it. I'm not saying what you're doing is wrong, but even if it is right, you must take everything into account. Why you ended up saving her is pretty simple. Seeing your eyes tell the story. Sunset jumped. Having forgotten her eyes had changed color in her encounter with the elite through that overwhelming phenomenon that she couldn't explain. My eyes? How does my eyes changing color connect to why I've done all of this? Sunset questioned. Sunset's grandmother took another sip, then resumed. Because it's something that has only happened once in the history of our existence, Sunset. The symbol of love between a vampire and human. Golden eyes. A blush met Sunset's face along with bulged eyes. This was not what she'd expected out of this visit. What do you mean? Sunset questioned. Another sip. Long ago, before the original 5 vampire lords were born, the first vampire to ever exist was born. From whom and how is unknown, but what is known is that when he was created, he was given one sole purpose: to kill and eliminate the human race. However, as the boy grew amongst human society, he found that they were not hostile creatures, but instead very much like him. He denied his destiny and lived amongst the people he was created to destroy, up until his 12th birthday. His body had gone through changes, just as humans do throughout their teen years, and upon the sight of the full moon, he went from calm and collected to being a ravenous monster. He attacked the town and killed all of them, sucking them dry of their life supply. Except for one. Amongst the massacre and carnage, one lone human remained, a young woman that he refused to attack. For what reason he did not know. All he did know was that she was one he could not harm. He came to his senses in her presence and ran, ashamed of his actions. Under the light of the full moon, he had made the decision to kill himself to keep humankind safe from him. But before he could perform the action, someone stopped him. The girl he could not harm. He tried to explain to her how taking his own life was the only way things could be right, but she refused to allow him to take his life, and eventually her persistence paid off. She took the boy away to somewhere safe, leaving the town and carnage behind. For the next 6 years, the human girl guided him on controlling his vampirism. Many times the boy had asked why she had decided to help a monster like him, and each time, the answer was the same. I don't know why. The two formed an unbreakable bond over those years, up until the boy had grown able to control his vampiric nature. That bond eventually grew into a romance and bloomed into a marriage. Upon their first kiss, a strange phenomenon took place, and when he came out of it, his eyes had turned golden, just like yours. Their bond couldn't be broken, and their life as one went on, living amongst the human race for years, up until the man's past finally caught back up with him. A child of one of the village's occupants had recognized the vampire responsible for his parents' death. One had been spared that night aside from the girl, and his grief had never faded. He wanted blood. One night, that very child, now a man, attacked the home of his enemy, blazing it into a display of hellfire. The man tried to escape the home with his wife, now pregnant with their son, but the fire was spreading too fast for both of them to escape. Wanting to carry on his legacy, he fought through the torrent of flames until he found an exit, and despite his beloved's wishes, pushed her through while the flames ate away at his flesh. Devastated at her husband's demise, the girl ran until she was out of sight of civilization. She survived and was found and taken in by nuns who had been out picking berries in the forest the morning she was found, but her appetite for vengeance didn't die. She swore vengeance for her husband. 3 months later, her child was born, the first half-breed ever to be brought into our world. She taught the child the same as she had her husband, but deep down, her thirst for blood grew stronger. A strength that eventually ended in the life of her husband's killer being taken without mercy. She didn't just kill him. No. She stripped him naked, tied him to a log, and threw him over a fire to be cooked alive. She watched every second of it, his screams resembling an angel's song to her, up until he was just on the edge of death. That wasn't enough for her. He had to pay the ultimate price. She tied him to a tree and cut out his tongue so he couldn't scream or speak. Her son had grown old enough to gain a craving for blood, so she presented her victim's worst nightmare to him, her husband's flesh and blood. She wanted him to die in the most poetic way possible, but for it to only be a one-time thing for her son to bear. Her son sucked every ounce of blood from his mother's victim, an act that would turn out to be a grave mistake. A vampire's lust for blood is very powerful, and she hadn't taken that into account. Once her victim's blood was sucked dry, the unthinkable happened. Her own son turned on her and killed her dead. With no control or guidance, that child killed off thousands, building a hatred and fear of vampires towards humans. Somewhere down the lines of history, the lessons of control evolved along with less of a craving for human blood. The rest is history. The story ended, and Sunset and Twilight sat with faces of horror. This was new to Sunset. Never before had she heard this tale of her kind's history. It explained a lot, but she wasn't still fully clear on why this tale was so important. Why are you telling me this, aside from the thing about the golden eyes? Sunset questioned. Because it's important you know of the true history that's been hidden from you. Her grandmother confirmed. Humans and vampires were once allies, up until an act of vengeance destroyed it. However, what's most important is the fact that the royals tried to hide the most. No vampire, besides the very first, is a pureblood. The real truth is that we are all half-breeds. Sunset and Twilight both gasped in shock. That's crazy, Sunset exclaimed. So the royals have been lying to us all along. Her grandmother nodded. Your mother knew the truth, which is why you were raised to hate the royals and order of our kind and not to despise humans like the royals do. She probably planned to tell you the truth when you turned 18, but the royals made sure to prevent that before it could even happen. Everyone needs to know this. Those bastards need to pay, Sunset shouted, rising to her feet. Her grandmother shook her head. Convincing an entire race is nearly impossible, my dear. The royals would have to say it themselves to even have a chance. Their grip on our race is just too powerful. Sunset sighed in defeat at her grandmother's words. You're right, but there's gotta be something we can do. I'm sorry, dear. I know you want to avenge your mother as much as I do, but if we let history repeat itself and let reckless actions decide for us, then we're destined to go extinct. Sunset clenched her fists hard, but eventually released her grip, sitting back down. Then, what do I do against Moleskin? I can't just give up on Twilight, not after everything we've been through. It feels wrong to just give up. You said it yourself in the story. The boy and girl had an inseparable bond and couldn't be separated no matter what. All of this didn't just happen out of coincidence or chance. It happened for a reason. What if history is repeating to repair what happened all those decades ago? The very first vampire is an example that it is possible for humans and vampires to be united. But we won't ever get that chance unless the royals are destroyed for good. I know it sounds impossible, but I believe that they can be defeated. We just need something to... Sunset stopped in her tracks, her mind having spiked a possible way to get an advantage over the royals. That's it, Sunset stated confidently. What is it, Sunset? Twilight questioned. Moleskin. That's how we get an advantage over those bastards. If I can defeat and submit Moleskin, we'll have a hostage to use as a threat against them. Do you really think that would work? From how you've described the royals, they seem like they wouldn't even care if you killed Moleskin. Twilight analyzed. Most of the time they wouldn't, but Moleskin is of a higher stature. He's important to all of the main rulers, so they'd care about losing him. Sunset assured. You'd be asking for suicide if you tried fighting him right now. Sunset's grandmother added. You'd lose immediately. Even with my enhanced abilities from the love-sealing transformation thing? She questioned. Her grandmother got up from her rocking chair, sitting her tea down on the side table, and walked to where Sunset sat. Get up, she commanded. What? Sunset questioned with confusion. Get up, her grandmother repeated. I want you to try hitting me with your best shot. If you can, you're ready to fight him. If you can't, you're still in need of proper combat training. Grandma, I don't want to hit you, Sunset stated with sincerity. You can't, her grandmother challenged, grabbing Sunset's arm and forcing her to her feet from the couch. Sunset was surprised, catching her balance and eyeing her grandma with distaste. Grandma, I'll hurt you if I hit you, she pleaded. Either you hit me or I'll hit you, the elder vampire threatened. Grandma, would you stop and lift? Her grandmother's fist connected to Sunset's nose. Sunset quickly comforted her injury and grunted in pain. Grandma! Sunset stated out of pain. 5 seconds or I'll hit you harder, her grandmother threatened. Sunset finally surrendered and got into her fighting stance. She took her best shot, throwing a fist at her grandmother's face, but it didn't connect and was stopped by one of her grandmother's hands. Pain met her instantaneously, a blow being thrown to her abdomen, and before she could even defend, her grandma's free fist connected with her chin and sent her back against the wall. The blows had done a large amount of damage, and Sunset found herself unable to even counter or move, collapsing from the blows. Twilight rushed to her aid, helping Sunset up and glaring back at her grandmother with anger.
Why were you so hard on her? She can't even stand.
She barked.
Dear, sometimes to get a point across, you have to give it to them straight.
Sunset's grandmother replied.
Give her 5 minutes. She'll be fine.
Twilight only continued to comfort Sunset, while the elderly vampire returned to her rocking chair and took another long sip of her tea. Sometime later, after Sunset's injuries had faded, she and Twilight were gifted with another cup of tea, an herbal tea designed to calm their minds of any turmoil within the past days. Both accepted their cups, sipping away slowly at the hot beverage. Sunset had swallowed her pride already, never expecting to be submitted to a painful and powerful defeat with 2 strikes. It had taught her a valuable lesson too, despite age or appearance, never underestimate an opponent. Another factor still remained though. How was she going to defeat Moleskin and take down the Royals? Setting down her cup after a short sip, she finally revealed her thoughts to her grandmother. I'm sorry I underestimated you, grandmother. She confessed in defeat. I just didn't want to risk hurting you. Setting down her own respective teacup, her grandmother eyed her with her glimmering amber eyes, a smile meeting her lips.
Thank you, dear.
She accepted.
You sure are less prideful than your mother was. I would have had to beat her 50 times before she'd finally given to her stubbornness.
Sunset giggled, imagining her mother being submitted by her grandmother with little to no effort. It put a smile on her face, but caused a tear to roll down her cheek as well upon realizing her cruel reality. I guess I get that from my dad, Sunset assumed. Her grandmother immediately answered with a wave of her hand as if she were shooing away something.
Your father is one of the most stubborn vampires I've ever come to meet in my time. You should have seen him when I was helping him pick out your mother's wedding ring. He couldn't remember her size and fought me over it until he realized I had raised Starry from birth. Even the employee was laughing at his naivety. Even you were horribly stubborn growing up, Sonny. You resembled both your mother and father too well, and at points seemed impossible to maintain. Even in your last visit, you were much different than now, and I can tell you that something has changed you. Sunset eyed her grandmother with curiosity. Really? She questioned, quirking an eyebrow. In what way? I've been nothing but demanding and forceful since I got here. Yes, but you've also been kind, respectful, and caring. Her grandmother countered. You put your friend first before entering, afraid of how I'd react to her presence. Checked her tea first, afraid I'd snuck something in it to harm her, and thought before striking me. The old Sonny I babysat all those years ago would have never done those things. Sunset gasped at the tea comment, her eyes going wide. How did you... Sonny, your grandma has been around for quite a bit. She's picked up a lot being around humans and seeing their interactions. Sunset merely rubbed her head, knowing she wouldn't be underestimating her grandma for the rest of her stay. She chuckled at her grandmother's words, allowing her to continue. The point is that something has changed you drastically, and it's for the better. Even if what you're doing is reckless, I can see why you're doing it. After all, love makes mortals and immortals alike do crazy things. Sunset looked towards Twilight, a blush adorning both of their faces in the light of the room. They found that their hands had met unintentionally and had begun to grip one another in a display of care and true love. I'll do anything to protect her, Sunset claimed,
her eyes still locked with Twilight's. Her grandmother smiled at the display, taking another sip of tea. Then I see that I can't stop you, her grandmother replied, setting her teacup back on the table. Just know one thing, granddaughter. Eventually, you won't be able to protect her. She will eventually have to protect herself from whatever Moleskin throws at both of you. I know. Sunset agreed. This is a fight that won't be easy to win, and if I die, at least I died doing something right. And despite what I am and what I've done, I will find her in death, no matter what it takes. Sunset felt Twilight's hand grip hers even tighter upon the end of those words. She turned to meet her beloved's gaze, noticing tears start to glisten in Twilight's tear ducts. As will I, Twilight declared with a look of confidence and promise. No matter what it takes. Sunset's grandmother finished her tea and placed it back on the table. Startling the lovers out of their trance, she got up and said nothing. The only indication of a response was a smile and nod, to which Sunset and Twilight both nodded at in return. It'll be dark soon. Sunset's grandmother started. You two are welcome to stay the night here, but with the full moon out, I suggest you try to avoid making any noise. The last thing I need is any other resident of this area suspecting me of giving a human hospitality. Sunset and Twilight caught on immediately, their faces turned red as a tomato and their faces being met with a massive blush.
Grandma?
Sunset objected.
We weren't even planning on that.
Say what you want, dear, but I know a female vampire's hormones are as rapid as your enhanced running speed. All it takes is a kiss, then it just progresses more and more. Twilight sank in her seat in complete and utter embarrassment, while Sunset just fell back in her seat with her hands covering her face. She hadn't been this humiliated since she had lost to Moleskin for the first time, and as much as she attempted to wipe her grandmother's lewd comments from her mind, she knew she would never forget them for as long as she lived eternally. The two lovers sat atop the highest thick branch of the ancient tree, Sunset having checked prior for any nearby vampires on the prowl. Knowing they were safe, they sat in the calm of the night admiring the moon in the sky that seemed close enough to touch, when in reality, it was millions of miles away from them. Twilight had relented against the idea at first, but Sunset had convinced her through the assurance that she'd be safe from harm, and now that she sat next to Sunset on what seemed like the top of the world, she was glad to have not ended up just going to sleep. Not like she could, anyway. She was nearly captured that day, and was lucky that Sunset had found and saved her in time. She wasn't sure if it was some power above giving her the benefit of the doubt, or just absolute sheer luck that she was still alive. But one thing was certain to Twilight. She was thankful that she'd trusted Sunset that night in her driveway. Sunset had opened up not only her life to a whole new perspective, but had also changed her into a more confident and brave person as a whole. 3 days prior, she would have never even dared to try and outwit a vampire elite force. She would have probably just ran or hid under her bed covers in hopes that they miraculously wouldn't have found her. Now, here she was, fighting against the forces of a vampire lord with very little fear or potentially failing. Hell, she had almost succeeded in outwitting the elites. That's not bad for a mortal with zero knowledge of vampires aside from what Sunset had taught her. It was an amazing feeling, something she hadn't felt in so long. While it put her life in danger, she didn't care. With Sunset, she felt alive and safe from harm, and while their first meet had been bizarre and rough, She was happy to have taken Sunset's hand in this crazy adventure. Sunset never would have thought that this would have ever been possible. What had started as a rescue mission had turned into an adventure of discovery and change. She had thought back to what her grandmother had said about her being different in her last visit here over 10 years ago. Had she really been so stubborn and reckless before Twilight came into her life? She had never noticed it, but normally people with stubborn attitudes can't see past their own ass, so it made sense if she had never noticed her own stubbornness. She reiterated all of the events in the past 3 days. Upon meeting and convincing Twilight to come with her, she had been a bossy and forceful bitch. Something she later apologized for after revealing her true identity and assuring Twilight that she wasn't out to make her dinner. Twilight had acted somewhat the same, but she had a good reason to, being taken out of town with a complete stranger and constantly wondering if she was being kidnapped or actually helped by this mystery woman. Regardless, before all of this, Twilight had been very rude and low on herself, so Sunset could assure that Twilight had changed majorly in the past days. However, the main event of this whole crazy adventure that came to her mind as the most memorable was the spring. It wasn't because of seeing Twilight's bare form and sharing her own natural form with Twilight's in the spring that it was memorable. It was due to the fact that that was the first time both of them opened up deeply to one another. It was a conversation that broke both of them from their comfort zones and formed a layer of trust between them. Something that they had done without hesitation and without fear of judgment, giving assurance that they both thought equally of one another and didn't judge one another for anything. A comforting aspect that broke all suspicion or distrust of one another. But what assured their love for one another? That was the one question that Sunset asked the most as she thought further on the events that led up to this moment. The spring brought them closer to one another for sure, but what sparked their feelings for each other? Was it all the effort she'd put into keeping Twilight safe from Moleskin's forces? The things they had in common? Their undying trust for one another? Then she thought deeper, and almost immediately, the answer clicked. While Twilight had been terrified, like any mortal would be at her true form when she had confessed, she had never seen, treated, or called her a monster like most humans would have. Despite what she was, Twilight had treated her as if she were any other mortal of her kind. She'd respected her for who she really was behind her folded wings and secluded fangs. Even her golden eyes didn't push Twilight away. She had loved her for who she was, and that's why Sunset had felt the same toward her. It only came to her fully once she saw that Twilight was willing to give her own blood to save her life. That was the assurance that Twilight not only trusted her no matter the case, but also couldn't bear to see her die. She loved her. While she had thought a relationship between a human and a vampire to be impossible at first, after all that had happened, as much as her transformation, she knew now that it was not only possible, but that she was destined to be with Twilight until death came to her beloved. Out of the stillness of the night, she took Twilight's hand in her own and held it tightly. Twilight followed, gripping Sunset's hand as if it were her life supply. "Sunset?" Twilight asked lowly. "Yeah?" Sunset replied. I need to tell you something." Twilight answered in a somewhat sad tone. Growing worried, Sunset turned to Twilight, her head low and a frown on her face. "What is it? Is something wrong?" Sunset replied in a concerned voice. "No, I'm just... Something happened today. Something odd." Sunset raised an eyebrow in confusion. "Okay, define odd," Sunset proposed. Twilight took in a deep breath and released it slowly before answering. "When I got on the bus, I started to feel sick and got urges to cry unexpectedly. Something that has never happened before.
And I don't think it's just a case of being sad because of separation.
Sunset's eyes widened in surprise.
Huh. That is odd. What do you have in mind that it could have been?
A short pause followed, but Twilight eventually found her words.
Given how rare a relationship like ours is, maybe it's an effect of us being separated from one another. Like, the farther we are from one another, the worse the effects. Perhaps, but I didn't experience anything odd like that. Aside from worrying about your safety.
Another pause.
Maybe it only applies to mortals. Vampires have more supernatural abilities than humans, so maybe a vampire-human bond is delicate and affects a human more strongly. It's definitely not impossible, but it's not like we swore any vows or wear rings as a seal. What could have caused this to happen?
Twilight dove into heavy thought for a moment to find what may be the cause, if this was actually being caused by their bond as lovers. One thing did come to mind that seemed logical enough, but it was definitely a long shot.
Maybe making love was enough of a seal. I'm not sure how vampire engagement works, but that might be a cause.
Twilight guessed.
Potentially.
Sunset agreed.
However, sex between vampires is very limited. It's an action normally done scarcely, because it's easy for a female to get pregnant. Without protection, it's normally a 99% guarantee, and can range from 1 to 4 babies, and my kind never uses protection. If we engage, it's for pregnancy.
Twilight's eyes bulged in shock.
It's not possible for 2 females to get pregnant, right?
Twilight panicked.
Sunset giggled. No. That part of engagement for your kind applies to my kind as well.
She clarified. Twilight exhaled a long sigh of unadulterated relief.
Oh, thank God.
She breathed, Sunset struggling to hold her laughter.
But you said you engaged for pregnancy only. So, the night we engaged, was that what was on your mind?
Sunset giggled yet again.
No. While my kind mainly engages for pregnancy purposes, we have an exception in it being for relationship purposes as well. She explained. It's just rare, and fucking torture during the times when females are in heat.
Twilight giggled at that, not expecting vampires to have an estrous cycle in similarity to animals. If anything, she'd assumed that it was exact to a human's period, but she was wrong.
That'll certainly be an interesting experience, if we live that long.
Twilight thought to herself.
Anyways, if it isn't our commitment to intercourse, then what else could it be?
Twilight stated. Sunset thought heavily for a minute, but found nothing except one possibility, but it seemed absolutely preposterous.
The only other thing aside from that could be that I carry some of your blood in me, but I doubt it.
Sunset stated.
Twilight didn't think mutually. No, that's actually very possible. Think about it. By carrying a part of me, we are connected by more than just our love, but by my own life supply as well.
Sunset stopped and thought, but upon analyzing Twilight's words very vividly, it started to make sense. Could carrying Twilight's blood cause an unintended connection that affected Twilight physically and mentally?
You may be right, but I can't be completely sure if it's the actual cause.
Sunset finally spoke. Twilight paused in deep thought. Then she found a solution to who might know if this was a possibility.
What about your grandmother?
Twilight suggested. She is quite experienced with vampiric history, so there is a heavy chance she could be able to know. Sunset winced, a smile meeting her face. That's right, she exclaimed. Why didn't I think of that? Twilight rolled her eyes, standing up and being careful not to fall to assured death. Come on, let's go see if she's awake. Twilight offered. If not, we can always ask in the morning. Sunset rolled her eyes in return. Vampires never sleep, Twilight. Sunset corrected. She's probably in the living room knitting or reading a book. Twilight nodded, unoffended by Sunset's correction. Right. Just get over here and take me down, she commanded softly. Yes, ma'am. Sunset agreed as she stood up and walked over to Twilight's position. Lifting Twilight in her arms, Sunset maneuvered carefully down the ancient mass, finding the window to the provided bedroom and sifting through the opening steadily. She lifted Twilight from her arms and onto the floor, Twilight's small and cute feet touching the wooden floor softly. Sunset moved towards the door, motioning Twilight to follow her, up until they were in the hallway that led to the staircase to the lower floor. Moving down the stairs, they came to just outside the entryway to the living room, a mild humming of a tune just audible enough for the two girls to hear. Entering the living room, Sunset and Twilight came to meet Sunset's grandmother in her rocking chair, a thick novel resting in her hands. She wasn't pleased to see them in her presence. Shouldn't you two be in bed? She spoke with irritation. Sorry, Grandma, but something potentially important has come up, Sunset confessed. The elderly vampire didn't sway, but upon closing her novel, she seemed open to listening enough. Very well. Given you two haven't given me a reason not to listen to anything you have to say, I'll oblige. Sunset nodded, taking a seat on the couch, Twilight following quickly. So, what has come up? Sunset's grandmother questioned. Sunset motioned for Twilight to speak by lightly punching her shoulder, seeing she had managed to come up with the possibility of her strange phenomenon. Twilight followed, clearing her throat. Something strange happened to me today in Sunset's absence of trying to outwit the elites, Twilight confessed. A strange phenomenon that made me experience a sudden urge to cry and get sick that I couldn't shake off. Sunset and I went over what could have caused it, and we could only find one reason as to why, but we aren't sure if it's even possible. She paused to allow Sunset's grandmother to collect everything. Her face spoke nothing, but upon two words, Twilight knew she had her interested in listening further. Go on. Twilight nodded, continuing to explain. So, the only possible reason we found was Sunset carrying some of my blood, which we had to take to cure a fatal blow. We think that it's causing an unintended effect with my body that gets worse by separation. Sunset's grandmother winced, clearly interested. It is possible, child, but just like Sunny's golden eyes, such a thing hasn't occurred in centuries. She started, setting the novel on the table. Back in the 1600s, before the first war with the humans, such an action was used for torture. Instead of infecting the human with venom, they'd suck a large amount of blood and leave a human in an isolated prison to suffer the effects for over a month. The vampire would travel a long distance after sucking the blood of the human and remain away for over a month, leaving the human to suffer an unholy wave of sickness, depression, pain, and eventually would lead to suicide. It was a torture method that was banned after making peace with the human race after the vampire and human war ended in a truce. Twilight felt her blood run cold, her face turning ghostly white. Sunset could see that Twilight was too horrified to speak, so she spoke up in her place. So, as long as I carry Twilight's blood, she'll suffer those effects when I'm away from her? Sunset questioned. Correct, my dear. Her grandmother clarified. Sunset panicked, horrified at this grim truth. Isn't there a way to reverse it? She pleaded. Couldn't you just extract it from me and dispose of the blood elsewhere? I'm afraid not. Her grandmother confirmed. She said it was to cure a fatal wound, right? Right? Sunset felt her voice die off, knowing what she was about to hear was nothing good. Then the blood must remain. Her grandmother clarified, sending a sick feeling to Sunset's stomach instantly. When human or animal blood is consumed without use of the venom, the blood remains untainted and doesn't deteriorate. The venom is designed to not only kill or convert our prey, but make the blood we drink break down into waste so it can escape the body. Without the venom, it cannot be broken down, and because untainted human blood was used to heal a fatal injury, if it's removed, the healing effect currently provided by the blood will be gone and the injury will be fatal once again, eventually leading to your death. I'm sorry, dear, but without her blood in your system, you'll die. Sunset looked to Twilight, her face still ghostly white in horror and tears growing in her violet eyes, then back to her grandmother once again. Then, what can I do, Grandma? She questioned shakily. Her grandmother hung her head. You either have to live with it and keep her close to you at all times, or there is one more alternative, but I don't think you'll like it, Sonny. Sunset had no other options in mind, so she just decided to hear the alternative option, even if she might not like it. Tell me. Sunset clarified, tears starting to escape her own eyes. Her grandmother only sighed heavily, lifting her head to meet Sunset's eyes with her own amber irises. You convert her into one of us.